Hello and welcome to the final episode in my podcast series on the Russo-Ukraine War. In this one I'm going to talk about why this particular conflict has become a matter of global importance that rivals World War I and World War II. Now, the previous items that we've talked about are matters which involve Ukraine and Russia directly. But once we put the conflict in a global geopolitical context, it becomes very clear why this is becoming a multilateral struggle between very large sets of the world on each side. In other words, while the West likes to pretend that everybody is on the side of Ukraine and the US, the fact of the matter is that even some of the United States' most important allies in Asia are in the process of tightening relationships with Russia, commercial relationships. And in fact, these relationships are already so powerful that US sanctions have exemptions built into them to appease some of the US allies. So, with this in mind, I'm going to start with what I see as the geopolitical interests of Eastern Europe. Now, one aspect of European history, if you go back more than, you don't even have to go back very far, but basically going all the way back is that European powers have had a tendency of dominating their neighbors. There are people who think, with some justification, that the EU is in fact a venue for this as well. But the big aspect in Eastern Europe is that the big power that has had domination over most of Eastern Europe for a very long time has been Russia. Part of the reason for this is that the Russian Empire came out partly of being repeatedly invaded by Sweden. Swedish Varangians founded Novgorod, which also the Novgorod kingdom eventually founded Moscow, became a part of that also. It also, different group of Swedish invaders took over Kiev early on, became known as the Kievan Rus, gave Russia their name. So this is a big thing that goes way, 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 way back. This was part of the fact that for a long time Scandinavians would go down to Constantinople, especially noble Scandinavians, young noble Scandinavian men would go down to Constantinople and serve in the Varangian Guard, and then go back and use the connections that they had serving Constantinople to further their own political careers. In fact, Norwegian kings from Harald Fairhair through Harald Hardrada, very different heralds, by the way, in opposite sides of the Viking Age, served in the Varangian Guard. So there was this massive traffic of warriors going between Scandinavia and Constantinople, and some of them had a tendency of stopping along the way and saying, "Hey, this is my home now." It's very interesting because a whole lot of Slavic personal names go back ultimately to Scandinavian roots. This include Olga, which is a form of Helga, and Vladimir, Volodymyr, both are forms of Valdemar. So large numbers of these names go back, and so forth. So I'm going to break this episode into a few different parts. Now, having talked about Eastern Europe is very, very, very afraid of Russian domination. Part of this is due to the recent history with the Iron Curtain, but in fact it goes a lot further back. There are also many countries, including Poland, also are quite wary of Germany. This is one of the reasons why you have this big argument going on over how World War II can be portrayed in Polish society. Can we talk about Polish people being active participants in the Holocaust, for example? My own view is it's one thing if Germany wants to say, hey, we did this terrible thing, let's not gloss over it and make sure that it never happens again. I think it's something very different when countries want to sweep under the table horrible things which their national heroes have done. So I'm very, very, very much opposed to this revisionism in Eastern European history regarding the Holocaust, but that's a separate matter. But at any rate, Eastern Europe's worried about this. They're basically the ones beating the drums the loudest in the European Union. And they have historical reason to be afraid, right? Western Europe has other concerns, and we'll get to those in just a moment. But I don't get the sense that Eastern Europe or Western Europe are really pulling the strings. I think it's mostly the United States. So now that we've talked about Eastern Europe, I'm going to talk about Western Europe, then I'll talk about the US and the Anglosphere, then I'll talk about the Third World, and I'll talk about Southeast Asia in particular. We'll talk about India, and we'll talk about China. We'll cover Indonesia, and then we'll talk briefly about Mexico and Argentina. So I'm just going to go ahead, and you may see some brief transitions at various points, but that's how we're going to do things. So on to Western Europe. Now, Western Europe, as far as I can tell, particularly France, sees this conflict through the lens of World War I and the way in which World War I led to World War II. This is why Macron gets up and says, hey, we need to make sure that we can still coexist with Russia after this war's over. And he gets booed for it a lot. There are people saying the same thing in the German government, not as publicly. But there is an understanding in Western Europe that you don't want to have a heavily punitive resolution to this against Russia, because if you do that, you empower people who say, our country is being crushed by those outsiders, and it makes it possible for somebody to rise to power who will be much worse than anybody you have in today. But the big thing is Western Europe doesn't want a major war, especially one involving large powers, non-NATO powers this close to Europe. This means you have a refugee crisis, it means you have a lot of other things. Europe's willing to step forward on it, but you don't get the sense that Western Europe is very happy about being dragged into this conflict. And I think that this is part of the reason why you see the German government being very cautious about how to act. Now, let's move on to the United States. This war has become, in my view, an existential crisis for the United States, and it should never have become that. You have to understand one thing, is that the United States has been the dominant power in the world now for 30 years. And in pursuit of that dominance over the last 100 years, the United States has done terrible things in many parts of the world. In fact, we like to think, oh yes, the United States would never do what Russia is doing today. We'd never invade our neighbor, never confiscate or annex half their territory. Don't just ask Mexico. Well, actually, don't ask Mexico. Ask anybody but Mexico, because that's what we did to them. That's one aspect of it. But also somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million, large, mostly Chinese, killed in Indonesia in the name of fighting communism. You have Pinochet, installed by the CIA in Chile, who was eventually indicted by The Hague for crimes against humanity. You have a really bloody civil war in Guatemala, just because the CIA didn't like the fact that somebody that in power decided to use eminent domain to redistribute land from US-owned fruit companies. And around the world, you see the same thing. I mean, and we like to think, oh, maybe it stopped after the Cold War stopped, but it hasn't. One of the reasons that I was very, very unhappy with the nomination of Hillary Clinton in 2016 was the support by the US for the Honduran coup. People would say, oh, look, we have all these climate refugees from Honduras fleeing to the United States. And my point was, yes, they're fleeing climate change. It's political climate change sponsored by the CIA. Because we sponsored a regime change there, and it wasn't pretty. Places sometimes have their ways of resisting. Daniel Ortega is back in power, although Ronald Reagan is dead, and Ollie North, well, I'm not sure where Ollie North is now. But I mean, even there, I wouldn't say Ortega is nearly as good of a leader as he was during the 80s. So we have to ask, why did the United States pick this particular fight? There are two issues. Number one, the United States has been, at least since World War I, extremely anti-Russian. In fact, the United States delayed getting into World War I because we didn't want to support the monarchical czarist government. Now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, people are saying, oh yeah, Russia can be our friend now. But we never treated Russia like a friend. We treated them as somebody who must be subservient to us. And a really good example of this is how we treated Russia during the Balkan Civil War. Oftentimes Russia would go in and use their diplomatic credibility with Serbia to give NATO an ability to come in and try to police things. And then the United States would sideline Russia and make sure Russia couldn't be a part of things any more than NATO had to allow. So this was a very serious issue, and this was happening during Yeltsin. The United States basically continued to push even a so-called pro-Western, super corrupt leader like Yeltsin up against a corner, and I think that this was part of what led to the rise of Putin. Solzhenitsyn, sorry, I can't pronounce his name, author of Gulag Archipelago, and talked quite a lot about this later in his life. Solzhenitsyn, I think. So, but the U.S., besides wanting to crush Russia, has a second interest in the area, and that's Iran. You're going to wonder, well, what does Russia have to do with Iran? And this is actually 2 stages removed from Iran. Part of the United States' strategy in the Middle East is to try to isolate Iran from any regional allies it has. One of the regional allies it has, partly because the U.S. has been opposed to them for so long, is Syria. Syria also has leased Russia a port in the Mediterranean. So Syrian regime change is something the United States would very, very much like to do. We've sponsored a whole lot of really ugly extremist groups along this process. Of course, we say we're not supporting the extremists. But you look at what the Syrian rebels are doing to ethnic and religious minorities, and they're pretty much all extremists. The only pro-pluralistic force in Syria is the current government, as flawed as they are. So Russia was kind of backed into a corner of supporting that government. They happen to be accidentally on the right side of things, in my view. I don't think that Putin made moral calculus on that. In fact, even Putin said there is no moral calculus on it. But the fact that the Russian army helped to turn things around in Syria delivered one of the largest foreign policy blows the U.S. has faced since the end of the Cold War. So the fundamental question from United States policymakers is what can be done to prevent this again. And in the context of that, even at the time, the United States sponsored a number of studies through private think tanks, one of them being the RAND Corporation. And the RAND Corporation came back, one of them, with a recommendation of trying to suck Russia into a war in Ukraine. Now, I've read the public version of the public fact sheet on that study. It doesn't specifically say it in that many words, but the implication of the few paragraphs that they devote to that possibility don't leave much doubt that that's in fact what they're recommending. They say the only thing is, you have to be careful not to widen the war. So, if you look at what the United States is doing, we have sucked Russia into that war. We have said, oh, don't you dare invade Ukraine, but we're not going to send our troops there. We have said, people say Biden's incompetent. No, he's not incompetent. He is doing exactly what the 2019 study suggested. And he's doing it very skillfully, I might add. So, from the United States' perspective, if you want to tie up Russian troops in Ukraine, you want the war to go in a certain way. You want Ukraine to lose as slowly as possible, and then you want there to be partisan resistance. So that Russia has to engage in a very long, very bloody, very costly occupation of the country for as long as possible, preferably forever, so that the United States has a freer hand in the Middle East and elsewhere. The United States, in my view, has absolutely no legitimate interest in Ukraine. And the United States has no way of participating in a just peace because the end goals of everything the interests of everything are so badly misaligned. But the problem is that the United States depends on being dominant in the world. And so if this is a means to dominance, then the United States will take that. The problem here is that if the United States loses dominance, then what will happen is the reserve currency will go elsewhere, public spending will suddenly become more expensive, and the United States will go through a massive economic and social and governmental crisis that we can only barely imagine today. So this is why the United States has to maintain that dominance and why this has suddenly become an existential crisis. So, sure, inflation at home, prolonging a war to achieve a worse outcome for everybody, especially Ukrainians. These are now things that the United States has to do. The thing is that this is more and more obvious to the rest of the world. This is why Germany is rebuilding their army. This is why Taiwan's looking for arms suppliers besides the United States. My own prediction is they're going to make they might at some point make a turnaround and start buying weapons from Russia. But the United States can't maintain the current approach, because at this point, all the weapons we're planning on shipping to Ukraine. There's nothing left for Taiwan. There's nothing left for South Korea. And this brings me to China, and then I'll get on to the next segment. But China is in a really cool position of not having to do anything and not having to make any decisions and not having to make any changes. Nobody's going to pick on China. China can continue to build all the infrastructure that they're building around the developing world, and what they do with what they ask for in response, in return for all of this, is not just enough money to make a return on investment, but also political support for China's position. So this isolates Taiwan. It also puts China in a position that when they do make moves, there will be less resistance. So China's in a great position. They don't actually have to do anything. And a lot of the rest of the world recognizes that there's something of a danger here, and that's part of the reason why so many countries are moving towards Russia. I'm going to come back and I'll talk about India and Southeast Asia, and then we'll turn our attention to Latin America. So, understanding that China can just basically continue doing whatever they want to do, in that they're not really sucked into this in the same way, has led China to adopt a position which I think many people in the West consider maddeningly neutral. China has been quite willing to criticize Russia in some regards. They've also pulled back from certain strategic research partnerships. But otherwise, they're quite happy to increase their consumption of Russian commodities, in part because they can get particularly Russian energy now at a much cheaper price than Europe. Now, one problem that Europe has is that at some point Europe's got to choose between cheap energy and foreign policy independence. And the problem is that if you choose foreign policy independence, that's going to cause really a massive tax on everybody that's going to be felt most severely by low-wage workers. So Europe is going to have to figure that part out by themselves. China doesn't have to. They can just pull in Russian gas, Russian oil, and use that to develop their economy, and do so at basically a risk-based discount. So on to India. India is terrified of China. India also recognizes that if they get into a major war with China, the United States, despite all the talks about alliances and so forth, is probably not really going to come to their aid in the way that they'd like. There are territorial disputes between the two countries ongoing. The United States has taken a completely neutral position towards those. That's frustrated the Indian governments. And so what terrifies the Indian government worse than just China is the idea that if the West succeeds in destroying Russia, that Russia could become a satellite of China, basically a client state to the Chinese regime. And if that were to happen, then all of the military might of Russia, all of the military technology of Russia, and all of the commodities of Russia would all get organized around whatever Beijing wants. So India wants to make sure that doesn't happen. How does India manage this? They are competing with China to consume as much as they can from Russian resources. This means India is buying up as much oil as they possibly can from Russia. They are working on trying to bring in a gas pipeline from Russia. And they're pursuing other areas. All the strategic partnerships that China wants to drop, India is saying they're interested in picking up. India would like to become closer to Russia than China is, because that would give them a hedge against Chinese dominance. That also means that Russia is the number one arms supplier to India. And this is why there's all these questions about, will the U.S. sanction India for it? Of course they won't. We'll sanction Turkey, but we won't sanction India. Why won't we sanction India? Because we need them. Another interesting aspect is that while the United States has now sanctioned Russian diamonds that are cut in third countries, like India, are not part of the sanctions. So India can import all the Russian diamonds and cut them and sell them in the United States, and that's perfectly in line with the sanctions. That exemption is there specifically to keep India happy. This gets us to Indonesia. Indonesia is holds the presidency of the G20 this year. Indonesia has had a very terrible relationship with the United States for a very long time. It doesn't look bad when you look at it on paper, but it's not very nice. The United States has done terrible things to Indonesia throughout their entire history as an independent country, and even before. A lot of people don't know this, but the United States bankrolled opposition to Indonesian independence following World War II. And in fact, not only got the British to try to crush independence, they also made it a part of the Japanese surrender treaty, so the Japanese had to fight Indonesians over this. And they bankrolled the Dutch to do the same. After and the major concern was, oh, look, their independence movement likes certain people who are communist. Well, that failed. Indonesia attained independence. The United States continued perpetually to undermine that independence. And this was the big reason why Sukarno had to restrict democracy the ways that he did over the course of his political career. And of course, it didn't work all the way, because eventually the CIA got their way. They formed a coup, or they endorsed a coup. The coup drove Sukarno from power, put him in house arrest, and then began targeting the Chinese minority, killing between 500,000 and 3 million, mostly ethnic Chinese, in the name of fighting communism, to appease the American masters. Genocide under the U.S. under U.S. sponsorship, and it's a time in Indonesia's history that holds a lot of darkness and pain. So Indonesia is not going to take the United States side on something uncritical. The United States doesn't have additional credibility on this. Additionally, being a non-aligned movement country and one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement, they have always been seeking a third way between capitalism and communism. And for this reason, being on the side of capitalism and democracy isn't a very appealing sell. So Indonesia is mostly interested in how can we avoid this conflict being any worse. We don't want global hunger. But they're definitely not severing ties with Russia. In fact, they're looking at purchasing Russian oil secondhand via India. that then they can use in domestic markets. And since Indonesia is a net oil exporter, this would allow Indonesia to export more of their own oil, meaning effectively that a barrel of Russian oil imported would mean an extra barrel of Indonesian oil exported. This sort of offset system doesn't pose any problem with sanctions, but it does raise a question of how successful these sanctions are going to be and whether you want to extend them to countries that are still doing business with Russia. I don't think anybody really wants to do that. Moving on quickly to Africa. Africa has a big problem. They're very dependent on Russian grain and Ukrainian grain. And due to the EU sanctions, they have trouble paying for that Russian grain. So the EU sanctions are actually causing global hunger. And they're causing global hunger because they interfere with the ability to purchase food. That's something that needs to be addressed. And while the EU is quite happy to talk about food diplomacy, it doesn't seem to me like they're very interested in engaging in it. So this is something which, in my view, will probably push many African countries to integrate with the Russian banking system directly, bypassing SWIFT, and therefore avoiding the whole issue altogether. Moving on to Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. I'll do that in the next segment. So moving on to Latin America. I'm going to start with Mexico here. Mexico has been increasing ties with Russia during this conflict. Why? Partly because Mexican people are, at least on social media, supporting the Russian side in this conflict to a large extent. So, having something of a populist bent, the government sort of has to go along with that, especially, if we're going to talk about wanting democracy, I guess that's democracy in action. But the question that we should be asking is why that's the case. And the thing is that while people in Latin America tend to have a lot of respect for Americans, in the sense of US citizens, they tend not to have any respect at all for the US government. In Mexico in particular, people learn in their history books about how they lost half their country due to the US invading and annexing it. And they're not inclined to believe that a choice between the US and Russia is going to be, choosing the US side here is going to be fruitful. Then you have a lot of pain that's come out of the last 30 years. Starting with, in my view, the Clinton administration. Now, the Clinton administration started doing something that was been talked about before, but really hadn't been acted on at that point. And they started building this border wall. The one that Trump kept promising to build was actually started by the Clinton administration, by Bill Clinton. And of course, like most of Trump's campaign promises, they were taken from Bill and Hillary's records. In other words, all Trump really promised to be is as bad as my opponent. Now, the reason why this is super relevant is because they started the border wall in occupied, in places where you have cities, of course, and they extended it out into the desert, but not all the way. So the policy became one of maximal death. We want as many people who try to cross the border illegally to die in the desert to dissuade others. That was the policy. And it started under Bill Clinton, continued under George W. Bush, Barack And Mexicans aren't very happy about this. They aren't happy about their compatriots dying because the U.S. immigration system is incentivizing people to take that sort of risk. And people who do, say, leave water in the desert are often prosecuted. One of my cousins was prosecuted for such a thing. So the United States has made a lot of enemies in the world, including Mexico, and Mexicans aren't very happy. So they're reflexively pushing away from the US point of view, kind of ignoring the irony that Russia seems to be doing to Ukraine what the United States did to Mexico. But again, I think one thing you can say is that the United States treats Latin America the way that Russia treats Eastern Europe. So that's an important point, I think, to note going into this. The next point is, like moving south, you have Brazil. Bolsonaro's in power in Brazil right now. He's portrayed as this terrible right-wing populist, and there's some truth to all of that. But the ties between Russia and Brazil in this regard aren't in line with any of that, or aren't tied to any of that. And in fact, Russia has been doing everything they can to bring in fertilizer from Russia under the radar because they want to avoid issues of ships not being willing to take it due to U.S. sanctions and things like that. So they've been effectively smuggling in Russian fertilizer, among other things. But the very interesting thing about this is the main opponent to Bolsonaro, who looks set to become president again of Brazil, is Lula da Silva. And Lula said things relating to the Ukrainian war that look just like they came out of Bolsonaro's mouth. Lula da Silva is a left-wing populist. I'm actually excited to see Lula possibly get back into power because of he did a lot of really interesting things with computing infrastructure for lower-income communities last time he was in power. But my point here is that Russian perspectives versus American perspectives are not on equal footing in Brazil either. Brazil is not really interested in continuing to be dominated by the United States. There's been some talk about the concern of, China might be able to build a military base in Brazil. They might at some point. But that actually goes to show that, if we're going to expand NATO around Russia, China might do the same thing to the United States. And if Russia is feared by her neighbors, the United States is feared by the United States' neighbors also, except Canada, and that's largely because Canada tries to be a vassal state. So moving on to Argentina. Argentina's also been maddeningly distant from this conflict from many people's perspective. They were happy to say, okay, well, while we're investigating war crimes in Bucha, Russia can't participate in the Human Rights Council. But they have been one of the strongest voices against any sort of efforts to marginalize Russia at the G20. Again, part of the problem for the United States in this regard is that the rabid economic control of Latin America has come and left a lot of pain, a lot of hurt. And people aren't responding very well to a cause which is largely pushed by the United States in this regard. So what I see coming out of this is that China as a whole is continuing to expand their role in the world. A lot of countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, don't want to see Russia destroyed and turned into a Chinese satellite state. So their approach has been to engage in additional commerce with Russia to make sure that doesn't happen. What this means as a whole is that the West cannot isolate Russia economically from the rest of the world. The West can only isolate themselves from Russia economically, and that's a very different matter. China, on the other hand, is in a very privileged position. They don't want to do anything regarding Taiwan right now, but they're quite aware that the United States was pushing this one China policy before China was, or at least as long as China was. The Republic of China used to have China's UN seat, for example. Republic of China being Taiwan. And so you have this complex situation there where China has all the cards and time to do whatever they want to, but you still have Hong Kong integration to deal with. You still have some of the rest of these things to deal with. The United States' commitments to Asia are pretty much exhausted by South Korea, let alone Japan. And so if North Korea starts making noises, the United States isn't in a position to help anybody else. So I see the Western response here as something which is a clear and present danger for Taiwan. I think it is I think it is something which will ultimately fail to isolate Russia, because so much of the world would rather see Russia thrive as a state independent from China. And I think that we will see a decline of Western power. And if we see a decline in Western power, we could see a sudden, rapid collapse of U.S. economic might, of the sort that we saw with the United Kingdom following the Suez Crisis in 1957. Perhaps even worse, just simply because the United States has so much extra dominance everywhere. As a whole, this conflict is reshaking alliances. You have NATO member Turkey, rather, that is continuing to buy weapons from Russia. You have China now delivering weapons to Serbia. You have NATO having to feel like, okay, now we have to take on China, which is now a bit of an overstretch. And my sense is that we will eventually see a situation where the alliances, particularly here in Europe, shift in major ways very quickly. I don't quite know how this will happen or what sides they will choose, but I think the sides going forward are going to be a choice between Russia and China rather than a choice between the United States and Russia. And because this is what most of the world is shaping up for. It's only the West that seems not to see that at the moment. So it will be interesting times ahead. and particularly when this war winds down, we may find that other conflicts suddenly heat up, especially if the West tries a Cold War type of approach to Russia in this case. At any rate, I'm wrapping up this series here. I won't be doing any more relating to the Ukrainian conflict. I think I'll have some other topics coming out over the next few weeks. So, see you soon.